Chapter 6. The Council of Chucks. Gandalf Chuck, who was much taller than most Chucks and one of a few hundred or so elite Chucks who had developed the ability to talk, stood steadfast, looking out towards the oncoming horde. As they drew closer, he raised his staff and brought it down swiftly, plunging it into the moon rock below.
"None shall pass!"
he bellowed towards the oncomers. The horde continued to move towards him.
"None shall pass!"
he roared again. Eventually, the first of the forthcoming party arrived and stood before Gandalf Chuck. Gandalf Chuck glared at the character, leaned down towards him and said softly,
"What is your name?"
"Yeah?"
said slightly quicker than most Chuck.
"Okay,"
said Gandalf Chuck as he moved aside, letting slightly quicker than most Chuck through into the secret hideout behind him. The next Chuck arrived and stopped at Gandalf Chuck's feet.
"What is your name?"
asked Gandalf Chuck again.
"Yeah?"
said Troublesome Chuck.
"Okay,"
replied Gandalf Chuck, and he let him pass. Eventually, Gandalf Chuck let the entire Council of Chucks pass into their secret hideout behind him, and the roster, as it had been for the last 12 meetings, was as follows. Slightly quicker than most Chuck, pointing out the obvious Chuck, a little bit naughty Chuck, Troublesome Chuck, Bad Chuck, Evil Chuck, Director Chuck, Alpha Chuck, Chuck Prime, Chuckatron, Despicable Chuck, The Chuckinator, Thanos Chuck, Agent Chuck, Chuck Almighty, Overlord Chuck, Ultimate Chuck, Total Chuck, Spawn Chuck, The One Chuck, and finally, Brian Chuck, who usually made refreshments and took notes of the meeting. There were 21 Chucks in total that made up the Council of Chucks, excluding Gandalf Chuck because he wasn't actually a member. They just invited him to watch the door during the meetings. The Council of Chucks met once a month at their secret moon-based hideout that rested, at this point in time, quite peacefully above Truly Bedrock Season 1. The current date was the 19th of August, 2019, and although the moon was a little broken and rough around the edges, and sure, bits of it occasionally broke off and smashed into the ground below, but for the most part, it was stable, currently uninhabited, and made for a strategic point where the Council of Chucks could monitor the goings-on of the server members below. Considering the wealth and power and knowledge that the Council of Chucks had access to, their secret hideout wasn't particularly exotic. It was a relatively small but tall room carved out from the inside of a small crater on the moon's surface. It had a dark oak and red carpet-themed interior, a little like a woodland mansion, with a ring of 20 chairs and a raised platform in the centre. The chairs were simple, made of stair blocks without any legs or fancy uprights behind them. Nearer the corners of the room there were 4 dark oak pillars, which helped to separate the main seating area in the middle of the room from the empty spaces around the edges. There were a few shelves, tables and storage spaces around the outside of the room, but otherwise it was a generally bland and uninteresting space. The Chucks took their places and turned towards the one Chuck who usually presided over the meetings. They waited for him to speak before pointing out the obvious Chuck pointed out that these meetings were completely pointless, as they all share a hive mind and can share these thoughts telepathically through time and space. The one Chuck raised his hand towards pointing out the obvious Chuck and slowly clenched what would have been his fist if Minecraft characters had fists. Pointing out the obvious Chuck let out a high-pitched, "Okay," and then instantaneously exploded into a light cloud of dust. The particles that were left of his circuitry gently floated down towards the floor around his chair as the one Chuck lowered his arm and said softly,
"Does anyone else have an opinion about these meetings?"
There were 9 non-elite Chucks at the meeting who all uncontrollably blurted out,
"Yeah?"
as the others all sat silently staring at the pile of dust that used to be pointing out the obvious Chuck. Despicable Chuck put his hand to his face and urged the one Chuck to begin the meeting. The one Chuck agreed, understanding that the non-elite's vocabularies were limited to yeah and okay, and turns towards the council asking the same question he had always asked at the beginning of every meeting since the first meeting ever took place.
"Has anyone seen or discovered the whereabouts of Chuck?"
he asked boldly as if expecting a different answer than usual. The council sat silent. Since the very inception of the Infinite Chucks, none of them had ever seen or come into contact with the original Chuck. They were well aware of him, and most of them regarding him as the most powerful Chuck to have ever existed, and for a bunch of angry maniacal robots, they reserved quite a lot of fear towards the original Chuck. Most were terrified in anticipation of his inevitable return. The one Chuck normally ended the meetings at this point, as pointing out the obvious Chuck had pointed out, there wasn't really much that they needed to discuss in person. Evil Chuck started to stand up from his seat when the one Chuck bellowed,
"Sit down."
He continued more softly,
"I have been made aware of a prophecy."
Light mumblings of yeah and okay spread around the room as the council shuffled in their seats to listen more intently.
"We all believe that it is Chuck who will bring about our end, correct?"
he asked without requiring an answer.
"As you all know, there is no information flow coming from beyond the end of Truly Bedrock Season 3, which will end 2 years and 2 months from now. We know this is when the infinite Chucks will be destroyed, and we believe there is nothing we can do about it. Do you agree?
asked the one Chuck, this time requiring an answer.
Yeah?
Said the council in unison.
Well, fear no more. I have been told of a prophecy which tells that our end is not brought by the return of Chuck, but instead by a new character to be created by FoxyNoTail around the time that Season 3 is set to take place.
Okay.
Said the council in unison.
I have spoken with Oracle Chuck, whose connections to the future run deeper than most. She explained how she is able to see outside of our universe and foretold of a new character, and how it is that character who will bring about our doom.
The one Chuck then read out the exact prophecy as it was told to him.
The infinite Chuck's demise will come from a new character born during the 3rd season of Truly Bedrock.
The murmurings in the room got louder as more of the council uncontrollably muttered yeah and okay in their worried states. Even the elite Chucks, who had a full range of vocabulary, found themselves mumbling those two words over and over as their robotic minds tried to calculate this information.
Shh!
Hushed Chuck Prime sternly.
Listen.
The one Chuck continued.
Do not worry. I have a plan to make sure the prophecy will never be fulfilled, and a plan that will ensure that the infinite Chucks will survive past the end of Season 3 and live forever after.
Go on.
Demanded Despicable Chuck.
I love despicable plans.
The one Chuck then laid out his plan to the council as they listened silently, fixated on every word he said. He detailed how the majority of them would begin the construction of a secret city far away from the reaches of the Truly Bedrock members. They would send Troublesome Chuck to meet with Alice, Zloy's powerful yet naive AI, during the period of Truly Bedrock Season 2.
As many of you know from the information we have received from future Chucks, the end of Season 2 brings the final devastation of the moon, with the Truly Bedrock members being saved at the last moment by the AI known as Alice. At the very moment in time that the moon hits the planet, Alice will take a rudimentary scan of the overworld surface and generate a crude but working simulation of a world within her remote systems. She will then attempt to teleport all of the members to a remote safe location where they will lie dormant in suspended animation until their inevitable rescue at the end of Season 3. We will hijack the teleportation signal and steal FoxyNoTail mid-teleport in order to put him in an exact copy of that simulation, which we will control ourselves. We will recreate his server mates via what will be our own dedicated AI system called ChuckNet. FoxyNoTail will live inside this simulation, unaware of his captivity, and we will witness the creation of the prophesied character from within the safe confines of the simulation. Director Chuck will oversee the operation and ensure that the simulation remains on course, and we will watch closely to discover the truth about that new character.
He continued.
Once we know who that new character will be, we will signal back to ourselves now from the future so that we can manipulate FoxyNoTail into never creating that character in the first place, thus preventing our demise and ensuring our future will continue past the end of Season 3.
Exactly 2 years and 2 months into the future, Geraldine turned to Big Chicken and then Junior and said,
We got the signal.
Her relay algorithm kicked into action as a surge of power came rushing over the ChuckNet. Within seconds, the exact coordinates of Chuck City appeared on the screen in front of her.
Whatever Foxy did, it must have been big,
she said as she frantically set the system ready to jump the ship to those coordinates.
Are you ready?
She asked, already knowing the answer.
We're ready,
replied Junior and Big Chicken at the same time. Geraldine engaged the jump drive. A low, droning sound swept over the ship. The floor and walls slowly began to rumble and shake, and then all of a sudden, the entire ship vanished.